At 176 verses, the Bible's longest chapter is intimidating. We know some verses from Psalm 119. Verse 11, I have stored up your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. Or verse 105, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. But if we read it all, we're not going to in this video for the sake of time, but I would encourage you to do so. And if you do, you will hear this theme. God's law is a matchless treasure. Verse 162. The writer says it's like one who finds great spoil. And this is true no matter our trials, as you can read about in verse 28. What does this mean, that God's law is a matchless treasure? Well, three things. First of all, we see in the psalm that God's law is good. Verse 39 and elsewhere. Now, we struggle to appreciate rules. We don't like rules. They feel restrictive to us. But God's law is how he wisely orders his good creation. His law is good because it's true, he says in verse 142 and 151. It rejects every false way, 128. We can trust God's word, verse 42. His reliable laws prove his mercy, 77, 156, as he delivers us from meaningless pursuits. Because God's word is true, it blesses those who do it. God's rules truly help us, 175. By keeping God's law, we fight the bondage of sin. We gain wise counsel. We live faithfully before God's face, and we find great peace against all odds. So God's law is good. Second, God's law delights believers. In other words, God's good law actually seems good to those who are beginning to see the universe from God's perspective. The word delight is used repeatedly in this psalm to describe the believer's attitude toward God's law. And we don't simply delight in God's laws because of their natural goodness, but because of how they reveal God and help us fellowship with him. In fact, the writer can hardly distinguish God from his ways. Listen to verse 137. Righteous are you, O Lord, and right are your rules. Spiritual people know that God's word can make them wise unto salvation, so they long for it. Verse 81. They want to do it no matter the cost. Verse 106. But third, God's law demands divine help for keeping it. The writer knows that he cannot keep God's law perfectly. He remembered God's commandments. He just didn't always do them, as he says in verse 176. I've gone astray like a lost sheep. And so he cries out for God's help. Throughout the psalm, he says things like this, let me not wander from your commandments, verse 10. This is how the law brings us to Jesus. Throughout the psalm, there's a strong note of promise. When the writer longed for the fulfillment of God's promise, for example, in 123, he was longing for Jesus who fulfills all of God's promises, as 2 Corinthians 1 verse 20 says. Even we who love God's law have gone astray. But Jesus, the Good Shepherd, seeks and finds his servants, as we read in the final verse of the psalm. And he puts us back on God's good path of life.